It was a quiet night, the kind where the city feels strangely still, and the hum of life seems to disappear with the setting sun. I was standing at the bus stop, just outside the convenience store on Main Street, waiting for the bus to take me home. It was already late, and I knew it was going to be a long ride. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the sidewalk. The usual bustle of the city had quieted down, leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay warm in the chilly night air. It was then that I noticed something odd. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked more closely, I could have sworn I saw figures standing in the shadows across the street. They were tall, motionless, and cloaked in darkness. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, they were gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the fatigue from a long day, or maybe it was the low, yellow glow of the streetlights playing tricks on me. I turned back to the bus shelter, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. But then, as I stared at the shelter's glass, something strange happened. The glass began to fog up, as if it had suddenly been touched by something cold. I frowned, confused. It wasn't cold enough for condensation, and there was no breeze to explain it. As I watched, the fog slowly began to take shape. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then it hit me. There were figures inside the bus shelter. They were standing still, staring directly at me, their faces obscured by the fog. Their silhouettes were blurry, like shadows cast by something that shouldn't have been there. They didn't move. They just stood there, their eyes locked onto mine, as if waiting for something. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, unsure of what to do. The street around me was completely empty. There were no other people walking, no cars passing by. The only sound was the faint rustling of the leaves in the trees and the distant hum of a far-off car engine. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their faces clearly. The fog on the glass thickened, obscuring more of their bodies, but their presence lingered in the air, cold and heavy. I tried to tell myself that it was just some odd coincidence. Maybe it was just a reflection or the way the light hit the glass. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel something unsettling in the pit of my stomach, something I couldn't explain. My fingers clenched around the strap of my bag as I took a few cautious steps backward, keeping my eyes on the fogged glass. Then, just as quickly as the figures had appeared, they vanished. The glass cleared up, leaving nothing but my reflection staring back at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I let out a nervous laugh, trying to calm myself. It's nothing, I thought. Just a figment of your imagination. Maybe you're just tired. But as I glanced around again, the unease in my chest refused to fade. I could still feel them, those eyes watching me, lurking just outside my sight. My mind raced, telling me to leave, to get out of there before something worse happened. I took a deep breath and started to walk away, making my way down the sidewalk toward the intersection. The bus would be arriving soon, and I wanted nothing more than to get on it and put this strange feeling behind me. I hadn't gone more than a few steps when I heard it, a soft, echoing footstep behind me. My heart skipped. I spun around, expecting to see someone following me, but the street was empty. There was no one in sight. I stared down the empty road, my pulse pounding in my ears. You're just being paranoid, I told myself, but the footsteps came again. This time, they were closer. Slower. Like someone was walking right behind me, their footfalls soft but unmistakable in the silence of the night. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath coming in short gasps. I could feel my skin prickling with fear, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck. I turned around again, faster this time, but there was no one there. The street was still empty. My chest tightened, and I began to back away, feeling a rising panic in my throat. My eyes darted from one dark corner of the street to the other, searching for any sign of movement. But all I saw was darkness. The sound of footsteps continued though, closer now. So close I could almost hear them breathing. I turned back to the bus shelter, hoping that the bus was approaching. but the figures inside the shelter were gone. The fog had cleared, leaving only the empty, cold glass. For a brief moment I thought I saw something flicker in the corner of my eye, just a shadow moving in the reflection. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I was certain now, something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't stay there anymore. My body screamed for me to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. Still, I forced myself to keep moving. I walked faster, almost at a jog now, trying to get as far away from the bus stop as possible. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, echoing in time with my own. My mind raced with every possible explanation. Had someone followed me here? Was there someone watching me from the shadows, playing a cruel game? I turned a corner, hoping to lose whatever or whoever was following me, but the footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent with every step. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt the presence behind me shift. The footsteps stopped. The air grew thick with a silence that was almost suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I looked around, half expecting to see something emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. The street was still empty. The only sound was the distant rumble of traffic somewhere far off. I waited, frozen in place, for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a trembling hand, I reached into my pocket for my phone, trying to call for help. As I glanced down at the screen, I felt a chill spread through me. My phone was dead. No signal, no charge, nothing. I glanced back at the bus shelter, my stomach sinking. The fog had returned, swirling thick against the glass. The figures were back, standing inside, watching me. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel them, their presence like an oppressive weight bearing down on me. My mind raced for any way out. And that's when I saw it, the bus, coming down the street, its lights cutting through the darkness. I didn't wait. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning, the sound of footsteps still following me, though fainter now. When I reached the bus, I almost threw myself inside, my heart still hammering in my chest. The doors slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed into an empty seat, trying to catch my breath. As the bus pulled away from the stop, I glanced out the window one last time. The bus shelter stood empty, the fog gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. And that it was still watching me. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Or maybe, there's something out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. All I know is, I'll never look at a bus stop the same way again. It was 3 a.m., and I was standing at the bus stop on a deserted street in the middle of nowhere. The last bus had just left, and I had missed it. I looked around, hoping to see some sign of life, but all I could see was the faint streetlight flickering in the distance. The street was silent, too quiet for comfort. Even the crickets had stopped chirping, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to keep the biting cold at bay. Late October in this small town always had that weird chill in the air, the kind that creeps under your skin and refuses to leave. But tonight felt different. It wasn't just cold. It was an unnatural cold, as if the air itself had turned against me. I checked my phone again, hoping that the next bus would be coming soon, but there was no update. Great. Just my luck. I was the only one at the stop. The few people who had been out earlier were long gone. The street was completely empty, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. As I stood there, staring at the dark street, I felt it, the unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I froze, instinctively glancing over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The street was still empty, just as it had been a moment ago. My heart started to beat a little faster, and I shook my head, trying to brush off the thought. It was probably just my imagination. The wind, the darkness, the isolation, it messes with your head. I took a deep breath and told myself to relax. But just as I started to, I felt it again, cold breath on the back of my neck, so close I could feel it like fingers brushing my skin. I spun around quickly, my heart hammering in my chest, expecting to see someone standing there, but the space behind me was empty. My breath came out in sharp, uneven gasps. The only sound was the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. It was just the cold air. That's all it was. Nothing more. But then it happened again. A sharp, freezing breath, like someone was right next to me, breathing down my neck. I jerked around so fast I almost stumbled, but once again, there was no one there. My pulse raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My mind raced through a million thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. It couldn't be. No one else was around. I quickly moved to the other side of the bus shelter, hoping the feeling would go away. Maybe the wind was just playing tricks on me, or maybe my body was reacting to the cold in a way it hadn't before. But even after moving, I still felt it, cold air, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing against my skin. I turned around once more, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. I glanced at the street again, trying to distract myself. There were no cars, no people, just the dim, flickering street light and the occasional rustle of leaves. The bus was taking forever to arrive, and every second felt like it dragged on longer than the last. I wasn't sure if it was the cold, the darkness, or something else, but something was definitely wrong. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, to run, but I couldn't. The bus was the only way home. I took another step back, closer to the edge of the shelter, hoping to shield myself from whatever invisible force was following me. But as I did, I felt it again, the sensation of someone standing just behind me, too close, breathing so close to my skin I could almost feel the warmth of their breath. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining it. But if it wasn't someone standing behind me, then what was it? My mind began to spiral. I turned around again, my heart racing, but the street was still empty. There was no one in sight. I took a few shaky steps forward, hoping to see any sign of life, but the street remained dead silent. The cold continued to press in, almost suffocating me. It was as if the very air had turned against me, refusing to let go. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left me. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was hard. Each breath felt heavier than the last, and my chest tightened with each passing second. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. I glanced at the time on my phone again, hoping the bus would show up soon, but there was no sign of it. The street was still completely empty. I moved back to the shelter, standing at the far edge, hoping to distance myself from whatever invisible presence was lurking behind me. I looked down the street again, hoping to see headlights, but there was nothing. Just the unrelenting darkness, stretching out like a void, swallowing everything in its path. The sensation of cold breath on my neck hit again, this time stronger, more insistent. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing right behind me, but once again, the space was empty. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My thoughts were a blur, like I couldn't think straight. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? But then, as I stood there, my eyes locked on something in the distance. A figure, standing in the shadow of the streetlight. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it. Something about the figure felt wrong, like it didn't belong. It was too still, too unnatural. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. I had no idea what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to leave, and I needed to leave now. I didn't wait another second. I hurried back to the shelter's edge, hoping the bus would arrive soon. I could feel the cold still following me, pressing in on me like a heavy weight. I glanced around one last time, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. There was nothing, no one. Just the stillness of the night. Finally, the bus arrived. I didn't hesitate. I jumped on the moment the doors opened, my heart still racing, my skin still cold. The driver gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I didn't even glance behind me as I took a seat near the front, too afraid to look back at the bus stop. The rest of the ride was uneventful, but the cold didn't leave me. It lingered, settling deep into my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even as I sat on that bus, miles away from that empty street. When I finally got home, I stepped off the bus and walked quickly to my front door. I didn't look back, not even once. As I fumbled for my keys, I felt the cold on my neck again. That same cold breath, right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened that night. But every time I passed that bus stop, I could still feel it, the cold, the breath, the presence. It was like a shadow that followed me, lingering in the corners of my mind, waiting for the next time the night grew too quiet, too still. I was waiting at the bus stop, just another evening, the kind of evening where the city seems to hold its breath. The streets were empty, the usual sounds of traffic and distant chatter absent, as if the world had suddenly gone mute. It was just me, the cold air, and the streetlights flickering dimly in the distance. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands jammed deep in the pockets, trying to distract myself by scrolling through my phone. The bus was running late again. I glanced around absently, letting my thoughts drift as I waited. That's when I saw her. At first, I didn't think much of it. A girl about my age, maybe a little younger, standing a few feet away from me under the flickering streetlight. She was wearing a tight red dress, one of those dresses that hugs you in all the right places, and high heels that clicked on the pavement with every shift of her weight. Long black hair spilled over her shoulders, almost like it was meant to frame her face perfectly. But something about her felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. She just didn't belong here. But that wasn't the strangest part. What made me pause and think was that I hadn't seen her walk up. I was alone when I first arrived at the stop, and then, out of nowhere, there she was. Just standing there, not moving, like she had always been there. My first instinct was to chalk it up to me being distracted, maybe having missed her arrival and my phone screen. But the longer I looked at her, the more it bothered me. I shifted uncomfortably, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. It wasn't that she was doing anything wrong, per se. It was more like she wasn't supposed to be there. Her posture was too still. People don't stand that still in a place like this, waiting for the bus, not without a reason. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't waiting for the bus at all. I had seen people like her before, on street corners, lurking, standing still, waiting for something else. It crossed my mind that maybe she was a hooker, one of those women who walks the streets at night looking for someone to talk to, someone to get money from. But there was something different about her, something darker. I glanced at her again. She was still staring straight ahead, not even acknowledging me, but I noticed her eyes were wide, too wide. The kind of wide you see in someone who's been awake far too long, someone who's seen things they shouldn't have. I quickly turned my attention back to my phone, pretending I didn't notice her. But the feeling didn't go away. A few minutes passed in silence. I checked the time, still no sign of the bus. I kept glancing at her, half expecting her to do something, anything, that would make her presence feel more normal. But nothing happened. She didn't move, didn't fidget. Her heels made a soft click on the pavement, almost too regular, as if she was trying to fit in with the rhythm of the night, but it didn't work. Her stillness was too deliberate. Too unnatural. I swallowed the growing sense of unease and told myself to ignore her. She wasn't my problem. Maybe she had a long night ahead of her, just like I did. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just the darkness and the silence messing with my head. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, something felt deeply wrong. I glanced at her again, but this time, her eyes locked onto mine. I froze. Her gaze was intense, unwavering. For a brief second, I thought I saw her mouth twitch, just the slightest curve upward, but that wasn't what made my heart skip a beat. It was the way her eyes didn't just look at me, they seemed to see me, as if they were reading me, scanning me for something. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I looked away quickly, hoping she wouldn't say anything or make some move to engage me. But when I looked back, she was closer. Just a little bit, but enough to make me feel the air thicken between us. Her heels had clicked softly as she moved, but it wasn't the sound of movement that made my stomach drop. It was the fact that I hadn't heard her take a single step. She had just appeared closer, as if she had materialized from the shadows. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing in my chest now. My fingers trembled as I clutched my phone, but the damn thing had died. No signal, no battery, nothing. I looked around, hoping someone else would show up, someone who could tell me I wasn't imagining things, but there was no one. Just the empty street stretching on in front of me, dark and silent. And her. I told myself again that I was overreacting, that I should just get on the bus when it arrived, and put this weird feeling behind me. But that's when she spoke. Her voice wasn't what I expected. It wasn't soft, like I thought it might be, high-pitched or seductive. It was deep, gravelly, like something was scraping the words out of her throat. It sent a shiver through me. "You're waiting for something," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or just muttering to herself, but I didn't answer. I wanted to ignore her, pretend I hadn't heard anything, but her words sank into my skin, settling like ice. I shifted uncomfortably, my pulse quickening. "Excuse me?" I asked, not wanting to engage but not knowing what else to do. She didn't respond right away. She just stood there, still as a statue, eyes fixed on me. It was then I noticed her smile. It wasn't like a normal smile. It stretched too wide, too unnatural, the corners of her mouth curling in a way that wasn't human. Something was terribly wrong with it. It felt like the smile of someone who had never smiled a day in their life. Or maybe someone who had forgotten what a normal smile should look like. I took a step back, my feet suddenly unsteady. "What are you?" I started to ask, but I couldn't finish my sentence. A cold gust of wind blew through the street, and when it passed, she was closer again. This time, there was no mistake. She was standing right in front of me. I looked up at her, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes. The whites were gone, completely black, like she had no irises, no pupils, just empty voids that stared through me. My legs went weak. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if her gaze had frozen me in place, as if I was caught in a trap. "Not everything is as it seems," she whispered, her voice much closer now, but still cold, hollow. Her breath was like ice on my face. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears, thundering with terror. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. I looked around again, desperate for help, but the street was still empty. No one. Just me and her. The bus arrived with a screech of its brakes, and I stumbled toward it, not daring to look back at the girl. But when I stepped onto the bus, the door closed behind me, and I quickly found my seat, trying to breathe again. I glanced out the window, hoping to get away from the nightmare I had just experienced. But she was there. She was standing across the street, her head tilted back at an unnatural angle, her eyes still locked onto mine. She hadn't moved, but I swear, I could feel her watching me, waiting for me. Her smile stretched impossibly wide as she stood there in the shadows, and the more I looked at her, the more I felt like I was being pulled back toward her. I looked away quickly, trying to focus on something else, anything else. But the image of her smile, her black eyes, and that chilling whisper kept replaying in my mind. And then I realized something horrifying. The bus wasn't moving. It was still. Completely still. I turned to the driver, but he was gone. The seats were empty. No passengers. The doors had locked behind me. There was only me and the girl, still out there, waiting. And that smile? It never left. It followed me, even when I closed my eyes. It had been one of those days, long, exhausting, and draining. I couldn't wait to get home, kick back, and forget about the chaos of work. The air was crisp and a little chilly, The kind of night that made you want to wrap yourself in warmth. But I was stuck at the bus stop, waiting for the 11:30 p.m. bus to get me back to my apartment. The only other person around was this old guy standing at the far end of the platform. I didn't think much of it at first, just an older man, probably on his way home after a late night. Still, there was something unsettling about him, the way he stood still and stared straight ahead. I glanced down at my phone, scrolling through messages and mindlessly checking the time. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional car driving by, but everything else was still. The buzz of the city felt miles away. I glanced back up, and the old man hadn't moved. But there was something off. His eyes were on me. It wasn't just a casual glance, it was like he was watching me, measuring every little movement I made. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just waiting for the bus too, or maybe he was just a bit eccentric. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just standing there like most people would. I adjusted my backpack and crossed my arms, looking down at my shoes as I tried to distract myself. And then it happened. He mimicked my move, crossing his arms exactly the same way. I froze for a second, thinking maybe I was just imagining it. But no, he was staring straight ahead, arms crossed, exactly like me. I shifted my weight, trying to test it out. I looked down at my phone, and sure enough, I could see his eyes flick to something invisible in front of him. A phone, maybe? I didn't know. But he was still locked on me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This guy wasn't just weird, he was weird. I tried to push the feeling aside. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But the longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I became. His eyes were still on me, no matter how much I tried to pretend I didn't notice. I turned around, hoping the action would break the tension. The soft scrape of my shoes on the pavement filled the silence. A second later, I heard the shuffle of footsteps behind me. But when I whipped my head around, there was no one there. My heart skipped a beat. The air felt heavy now, thick with something I couldn't quite explain. I quickly turned back to face the street, trying to shake the feeling of unease creeping over me. I heard the distant rumble of the bus coming, and my body instinctively tensed, relief washing over me. The lights of the bus glowed in the distance, and I forced myself to focus on it, counting the seconds until it would be here, so I could get on and forget about the strange old man. The bus finally pulled up to the stop. As the doors swung open, I took a step forward, ready to climb on and find my seat. But then I froze. The old man was standing there, right in the aisle. I don't even know how he got there. He hadn't been on the platform when I looked away, had he? And yet there he was. His eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, unwavering. His stare was so intense, it felt like he was trying to look through me, into something deeper. The hairs on my arms prickled. I stepped back instinctively, unsure of what to do. The doors closed behind me with a mechanical hiss, and the bus started moving. I looked back to the aisle, but the old man wasn't there anymore. My stomach twisted. Had I imagined it? I couldn't have, could I? The bus was nearly empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The old man's presence was still hanging over me like a fog. My hands were clammy, and I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see him standing outside, watching me. As the bus rolled down the street, I tried to distract myself. I fiddled with my phone, scrolling through messages I didn't really want to read, just trying to escape the knot in my stomach. But I couldn't focus. The memory of his stare was burned into my mind. His eyes had felt cold, like they saw something I couldn't. I thought I had gotten away from him, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't. By the time the bus started slowing for my stop, I felt like a weight had been lifted. The familiar sight of my apartment complex loomed ahead, and I couldn't wait to get off the bus and lock myself inside. I stood up, gripping the metal pole as I made my way toward the exit. When the doors opened, I stepped off the bus, my heart still racing. I turned to glance back at the bus, half expecting to see him standing there in the window, staring at me. But the bus had already pulled away, its headlights fading into the night. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, but the strange feeling didn't go away. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty street. It felt like something was still there, following me, even though I couldn't see it. I reached my building and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I thought I'd left it all behind, but the memory of that man haunted me for weeks. The way he mirrored my every move, the cold, unblinking gaze, it stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I never saw him again, but sometimes, when I'm walking down the street, I can't help but wonder if he's out there, waiting for me to notice him again. It might sound crazy, but part of me still feels like he's out there, somewhere. Watching. Waiting. I can't shake the feeling that night wasn't just a strange coincidence. It felt like a warning, a reminder that not everything is as it seems. That some people, or things, are out there, and they're paying more attention to us than we realize. I've always been at the bus stop at noon, but this time was different. I was just standing there, minding my own business, when I noticed her. A woman, dressed in black, standing at the far end of the stop. She had this veil covering her face, and the weirdest thing, she didn't cast a shadow, even though it was bright and sunny. The late summer sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, baking the air thick and heavy. Usually, the midday sun created a patchwork of shadows from the oak tree overhanging the bus shelter and the people waiting, but this woman, she was a void in the dappled light. I figured she was just another weirdo. Our city, Oakhaven, attracted its share of eccentrics. Street performers, artists with wild hair and even wilder ideas, the occasional muttering man with a shopping cart full of, well, let's just say, unidentifiable objects. I'd seen it all. This woman, though, had a different quality. A stillness, a wrongness that sent a prickle of unease down my spine despite my attempts to rationalize it away. Her black clothing wasn't unusual. Lots of people wore black, especially in the summer heat, opting for its ability to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. But the veil, it was heavy, dark, and seemed to absorb the light around her, creating a subtle darkness that clung to her like a second skin. It wasn't the type of veil you'd see at a wedding either. This was something else entirely, something antique and ominous. I tried to ignore her, focusing on the faded poster for the Oakhaven Autumn Festival plastered to the bus shelter, but my eyes kept drifting back. It was unsettling, this constant pull towards her. I told myself I was being silly, that the heat was making me irrational. I glanced at my watch. The bus was 15 minutes late. But then I noticed it. The subtle shift in perspective, the slight alteration in the distance between us. She was closer. Too close. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't a slow walk, it felt like she'd teleported. One moment she was at the far end of the shelter, obscured by a pillar, the next she was only a few feet away. The unsettling feeling escalated into a full-blown panic. The bus finally lumbered into view, a blessed relief. I practically threw myself onto the bus, scrambling for a seat near the back. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief, feeling as though I'd escaped something truly dangerous. I concentrated on the scenery blurring past the window, trying to forget the strange woman. Then I saw her reflection in the glass. She was sitting directly across from me. The reflection was sharp and clear, and just as I'd seen moments before, the black robe, the ominous veil, the unsettling lack of a shadow. But then, I turned to look at her through the glass, and she wasn't there. The seat was empty. The space next to it was empty. There wasn't a single trace of her, even the air around the seat seemed untouched by her unnatural stillness. I stared at the empty seat, my breath held in my chest. It felt colder than the rest of the bus, colder than the air-conditioned space itself. It was as if the temperature in the immediate vicinity had been lowered just enough to send a shiver down my spine. I felt a cold dread creep into my bones. Even thinking about it sends shivers down my spine now. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't been on the bus. She couldn't have been. I'd seen her reflection clearly. It was real, almost too tangible. But there was no way she got on the bus. There were passengers boarding and alighting, none of whom resembled her. Yet, she was there. In my mind, in her reflection, and in the chilling presence that settled over me. The journey felt interminable. I barely registered the other passengers, their conversations a muted background hum to the growing dread in my heart. The burning sensation on my neck. I knew what it was. Her eyes. I could feel her eyes burning into me, even though I couldn't see her. It was a feeling, a knowing, a sense of being completely exposed, completely vulnerable. They were cold, empty, and filled with an ancient, consuming malevolence. I kept glancing across the aisle, convinced that at any moment she'd appear. Not in the reflection, but in reality. That she would materialize within the cramped confines of the bus and finally take hold of me. The rest of the ride was experienced in a haze of unease and fear. I felt a presence, a weight, an essence that clung to me from that empty seat. When I finally reached my stop, I practically ran off the bus, not bothering to wait for the change. I didn't look back, only wanting to put as much distance between myself and her as possible. I walked home in a daze. I don't remember the route at all. It's as if the familiar streets, the houses, the businesses, became blurry and indistinct. Only the unsettling echo of her presence, of her eyes, remained etched in my memory. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sent jolts of fear through me. I kept seeing her in my mind's eye, the black robes, the concealing veil, the absence of a shadow. Her presence felt like a cold, smothering blanket. The next day, and the day after, a strange unease settled upon me. I haven't been back to that bus stop since. I take different routes. Change my routine. I can't stop thinking about the woman in black without the shadow, the woman who was and wasn't there. Was she real? Or was I hallucinating because of the stress? I've asked myself this question 1,000 times, and I still don't have an answer. But the chilling truth is this: I know she was there. I know it wasn't just an illusion. I felt her essence, her cold, ancient power. And the constant, unrelenting feeling of her eyes watching me from the unseen, from the shadows of reality. They burn into me, still, even now, a cruel, terrible eternity that knows no rest. And that's the most terrifying part of all, the knowledge that she's still out there, and that I might not be safe from her watchful, shadowy gaze ever again.